Hello and welcome to this long-term close reading project of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. My name is David, and if this is the first video which you're watching, I'd recommend to check this playlist of videos first, and there's a whole sequence of videos, and it might be better to start viewing them first in order to catch up with the group of travelers up the Magic Mountain. How does this project work? Every give or take week or so, I'm making a video in which I present consecutively a section of about 30 pages of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. I will just give a very rough and short summary of what happened in the chapter and in the beginning, and then I start sharing my observations and my thoughts and my interpretation of this chapter with you. Okay, in this week we read the chapter The Dance of the Death, so what happened? In this section, Christmas comes and goes without leaving a very profound impression, and I got the impression that here Christmas is only celebrated very half-heartedly. I think this is already indicated in the phrase, the Christmas holidays came and went, and I'd rather translate the German original in a slightly different way, something like Christmas took place, because the German text describes it like really an external event, something that takes place outside the Berghof theater without an active involvement of the people here. Sort of an event which you let simply pass by. And then after Christmas, the great dying begins. Winter doesn't seem to be a good time for tuberculosis patients. And during this time, however, we also experience a change in Hans Castrop's character and in his actions. He suddenly takes an interest in the dying people, in the ones who are condemned to death. He finds it downright immoral that dying is and the dying ones are so ignored in the Berghof, and he wants to make the last days of the condemned a little more beautiful by paying them attention, paying them visits, and giving them small gifts such as flowers. I have divided my observations in 5 points. Number 1, the Dance of Death motif. Number 2, the Catalogue of Vices. Number 3, the motif of the night. Number 4, 7 plus 3 equals 10. And number 5, this is a mixed bag of various secondary or smaller motifs, which I will comment just shortly. Let's start with the first part, the Dance of Death motif. The Dance of Death is the title of this section, and for centuries, Dance of Death was a popular motif in European painting, and it was always connected with a sort of instructive or admonishing character. It's typical of Dance of Death scenes that they depict representatives of all possible ages, of all possible social classes and profession, and that they show in various ways that all these people are equally doomed to die. One day, death will take them all, or will take us all. And it is certainly interesting for the genesis of the novel that one of the most famous Dance of Death paintings in Europe was located in Lübeck's St. Mary's Church, just a few meters from Thomas Mann's parents' house, really almost directly opposite the house. So Thomas Mann knew this painting very well. He saw it quite often. Unfortunately, this Dance of Death painting was destroyed during the World War II in a bombing raid in 1942, but there are still a few photographs and other reproductions existing, so to give you an impression of how this picture looked like. So this Dance of Death showed a round dance of 24 people, from the Pope to the child in the cradle, all engaged in a macabre dance with skeletons to symbolize death. And so the key message is, in the midst of life, we are in death. And so and before death we are all equal, we are all mortal. And just as the Dance of Death paintings depict a panorama of society, and this chapter in the novel also shows us that people from all different walks of life and professions fall into the hand of death at the Berghof. There are in total 10 people portrayed here who are dying, 10 dying people with whom Hans and Joachim come into contact in various ways in this chapter or sub-chapter, let's call it. So then number one, there's the gentleman rider, and in a flashback, Mr. Fritz Reuter, both people who are reminiscent of horsemen and knights, either through their job title, like the gentleman rider, or by means of their surname, because Reuter is just a dialect version of the German word for a rider. So I will say more about the Knight motif later. There's number three, Laila Gerngross, a young girl, or would say, let's say, a teenager of 16 or 17 years. Then there's Fritz Rotbein, the son of a doll manufacturer, and he's a merchant through and through in his thinking. Then there's the overfilled one, the lady whose surname is Frau Zimmermann, Zimmermann is the German word for carpenter. So there's another profession indicated here. And there's this Russian insurance agent, Anton Karlovich Ferge, as an employee of an insurance company. This is an absolutely modern profession. But however, his surname Ferge is also a northern German dialect expression for a ferryman. And a ferryman is a rather medieval profession, but there's also a mythological allusion here. Charon, the ferryman who ferries the dead across the river Styx to the realm of the dead in the antique mythology. And there is number seven, Lauro, the second son of tous les deux. So we learn nothing about his profession. He's probably still too young to have a profession. He seems to be a son by profession, but a very arrogant one who is dedicated to glory. He wants to die in a glorious manner, like a hero. So his name Lauro fits naturally, because Lauro is the Latin and Italian word for laurel. So he's someone who wants to die a heroic death, so he deserves a laurel wreath. And then there's number eight, the boy Teddy. There's a very young boy, a pupil, more or less a male counterpart to Laila Gerngross. And there's number nine, Mrs. von Mallinckrodt, who suffers from many illnesses, and she's outwardly disfigured, but nevertheless she's extremely vain. And there's an interesting name connection here, because there is indeed a noble family in northwestern Germany with the name of von Mallinckrodt, in the province of northwestern Germany of Westphalia. And probably the best known bearer of the name was Pauline von Mallinckrodt. She lived from 1817 to 1881, and she founded Catholic nun order, the order, the Kongregation der Schwestern der christlichen Liebe, that would translate as Congregation of the Sisters of Christian Charity. And this order was particularly dedicated to the care and education of blind children and multiply disabled children. So on the one hand, this Pauline von Mallinckrodt, the real Mrs. von Mallinckrodt, is a figure who stands in stark contrast to the vain and self-centered Natalie von Mallinckrodt in the novel. On the other hand, this connection between the name Mallinckrodt and caring nursing is established here by Hans, who takes special care of Mrs. Mallinckrodt, sometimes even feeding her porridge as if she were a disabled child. So there is this connection here. And then there's number 10, Karen Karstedt, the 19-year-old old, destitute and doomed, but not yet so ill that she is bedridden. So Hans and Joachim take special care of her and invite her on short trips, outings, go to the movie, to the cinemas, and so on. So 10 completely different people, of course, no popes or cardinals among them, but nevertheless, they cover a really broad spectrum of social groups and professions of that time. So how is it that Hans suddenly discovers his inclination towards charitable activities, towards active charity? We're not given a very precise explanation here. There are a few small clues, however, and my guess is that Hans' preoccupation with the big questions of life, as it was described in the previous section, so where he pondered about what is life, what is death, what is the human existence, and his subsequent decision in favor of love and life, that all this has contributed to a certain maturation of his character, so that this has been an eye-opener for all the suffering all around him, and for the hopeless, desperate situation of the dying, who seem to have so much hunger for life. And he seems to have matured morally, because to him it seems now downright immoral that death and dying at the Berghof are so hidden from view, that everything is done to spare the patient's confrontation with death and contact with the dying. But then, on the other hand, it also seems as if he's ultimately still just a big child who has returned to his earlier childhood moods and reveries. He seems to be as fascinated as ever by everything to do with death, the serious and the solemn tone of the clerical, the mysterious formulas of the church's Latin, his childish fantasy that he could have become a clergyman as well. And also in this conversation with Joachim about the Spanish king Philip II and his clothing also points to this. I think this is a clear reminiscence or an allusion to his grandfather Castor, who also was dressed in a similar old-fashioned way, with a similar old-fashioned collar and the black clothing, like the Spanish clergy and kings. And after a long time in this novel, again, this behavior is described again, the behavior that he showed as a child, that in moments of emotion or melancholy, he inclines his head and his mouth is half open, like a little dreamer. So here again, we have this ambivalent image of Hans that remains still quite unclear. So is he a mature character, or is he just a daydreaming child? This remains open and unclear. And also Hans seems to be aware of his unclear, of his ambiguous situation. So I think there's no other explanation for his great fear of meeting fellow citizens of Hamburg, perhaps even people who know his family and to whom he could have to explain why he lives there in this secluded world instead of joining starting his occupation as an engineer, etc. So I think there's another level of uncertainty, because he knows that Settembrini, his mentor, does not approve this preoccupation with death and the dying. So the picture that we get of Hans has thus become one or two facets richer, but not clearer, less ambiguous. So Thomas Mann continues to keep this character in a sort of suspenseful limbo for us. So it makes sense. We still have to go 500 or 600 pages along with this character. So there need to be some mystery and some secrets. Let's move on to point number 2, the Catalogue of Vices. Just as popular as the Dance of Death, there was a second type of painting in the Middle Ages, with a similarly instructive or admonishing spiritual intention. And these were depictions of the attitudes or character flaws that were considered vices or even sins or deadly sins. So today we usually talk about the so-called 7 deadly sins, and this list of 7 sins goes back to the so-called Catalogue of Vices that was made by Pope Gregory the Great, who listed the 7 cardinal vices or deadly sins. So pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. But he was not the first one to invent those sort of catalogs of vices. They have a longer tradition. There were also somewhat modified lists of vices long before Gregory, even before the age of Christianity in the Greek and Romans way of thinking. There was this sort of lists or catalogs of vices, and also after Gregory, the Pope Gregory, there were other lists. Sometimes they included 7, sometimes 8 vices or sins. And we see something of that we see in that picture. I think I got the impression that the narrator does not commit himself here to just one specific, more or less official church catalogue of vices. But nevertheless, in this chapter, he offers us a fairly comprehensive overview of human vices and passions. And I think this makes a lot of sense in a chapter like this, which deals with the great and serious questions of life and the end of life. I think it's precisely in the face of the existential threat of death that character weaknesses or vices become particularly prominent. On the one hand, one option because people are lacking the energy that is necessary for the control mechanisms, or because they want to deliberately commit these vices out of a hunger for life. It's a panic that time is running out, so you want to spend the short remaining time as uninhibitedly as possible with an unbridled way of living. So here a few obvious examples from the text where the people's behavior seems to be sort of a representation of vices. So there's arrogance and pride. So the young Tous-les-deux, Lauro, who wants to die a heroic death. There is lust, this lawyer Einhuf, who is a seducer of lonely young women. There's gluttony and greed, so the carousing and gambling young man, nicknamed Max and Moritz. There's vanity, Mrs. Wallengroth. There's envy and gossip, Mrs. Stör. And there's inertia. I think that relates to all of the patients who have a lot of free time to spend, and many of them do not use the time in any way to educate themselves. They are just spending this time in a very lazy, unoccupied way. Okay. I'm sure you will be able to find more examples, even more convincing ones if you're sure. It's just an invitation to take a closer look at the text from this perspective. What is the sort of panorama of character flaws that Thomas Mann is presenting us here in the face of death? Let's move on to point number 3, the rider or knight motif. So this is, I think, a somewhat more subtle motif. However, I think it's striking that the first dead man in this chapter is introduced with his job title, the gentleman rider. And also that Fritz Reuter, the first dying man that Hans saw in the first chapters, that Fritz Reuter is mentioned here again, because Herrenreiter, it's the name used in the German version of gentleman rider, and Reuter. Reuter is just a German dialect form of rider, and so they are both terms that allude to horsemanship or to knighthood. And I think in this section, with its multiple allusions to the Middle Ages or the very early modern period, so the dance of death paintings, the Spanish court of Philip II, and so on. All these allusions fit very well into the atmosphere of the Middle Ages, the medieval setting, and knighthood. And we also have seen from the very first 2 points, the Dance of Death and the Catalogue of Vices, that this chapter seems to be strongly inspired by medieval and early modern pictorial representations of the elementary dangers and threats of life, so sins, vices, and death. And now you may probably need a little bit of background information to follow me on my next point, then in order to realize that Thomas Mann also had a very special relationship with sort of medieval engravings made by the German graphic artist Albrecht Dürer. I've already pointed out the special significance of Dürer's engraving Melancholia 1 in previous videos. This engraving that shows all these symbols that are symbols of melancholy. But there's a second engraving by Dürer that is also considered one of his 3 masterpiece engravings, and that Thomas Mann knew quite well and that he was very impressed by. And I believe that there are allusions to this engraving also hidden in this chapter. Admittedly, that is a bit speculative, but I think it's a reasonable sort of speculation. It is the engraving with the title Night, Death, and the Devil. And I'll just add one more point to explain why I see a connection to this picture or engraving Night, Death, and the Devil in the text. So the reference to night and to death, I think it's obvious now, I hope, after my explaining. And after all, incidentally, also the short quote from the carol that is sung on Christmas Day also prepares the Knight Motif. The German title of this song is "Ich trage meine Minne," so I'm carrying around my love, but or I carry my love with me. You could translate it like that, but one should notice that the German original doesn't use the regular German word for love here. It uses a word that is almost exclusively reserved for the courtly love of the knights. So this song title is an unmistakable reference to knighthood. So that this becomes very obvious to any German reader that this specific word is here for love, for this courtly, knightly love. But then so we have death and we have the night, but we also have, this chapter also describes a figure with clearly diabolical traits, namely the lawyer Einhof. And firstly, there's the name. Again, I have to explain a little bit of German here. Einhof is an unusual family name. It means one hoof or single hoof. So and now it may become clear the allusion to the devil, because in many legends or in many medieval paintings, the devil, when he appears to people, he is usually described as someone who does not look 100% like a human, but who has at least a horse's foot or a goat's hoof, or that is at least one hoof. So one hoof, in German ein Hoof, that's the name is a really clear indicator of this diabolical nature. And then Einhof is described as having a goatee. So the goatee is also a typical diabolical, devilish attribute. And the black-haired hands also fit the picture, because at least in medieval paintings, the devil is often depicted with lots of black body hair. So night, death, and the devil are 3 figures or powers that are alluded to in this chapter very often, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly. Perhaps you will go in search of further clues yourself. And Death, Devil, and the Knight is also the title of this engraving by Albrecht Dürer that Thomas Mann was very fond of. And yeah, as I said, an engraving that Thomas Mann was very well acquainted with, and he was very impressed by. And here's a depiction of this engraving. There's a lot of literature, abundant literature about the interpretation of this engraving. So I don't want to say much about it, just a few hints. The knight looks like someone who is still full alive, full of energy and strength. But Death, with this ominous hourglass in his hand, is already riding at his side. And it looks as if the horse on which Death is riding will soon block the path, thus putting an end to the knight's path of life. So Death can therefore be seen as something we are inevitably heading towards. There is no escape. In contrast, the devil is positioned behind the knight. And I think this is not just a coincidence, that's just a random fact. Incidentally, you can see only one leg of the devil in this engraving, the leg with the hoof, of course. So if you take a look at the bottom right corner of the engraving, the second hoof from the bottom right of the engraving looks different from the many horses' hooves that we see in this picture. It looks more like a goat's hoof, so a clear attribute of the devil. So the ein hoof, single hoof, one hoof, that's him. And the head has also something goat-like about it, and very peculiar due to the very strangely shaped horns, and this thick hair is also striking. So from the devil's position behind the knight, one could speculate that this is the expression of the fact that, unlike Death, who is inescapable, with the devil, the situation is a bit different. There is the possibility of avoiding him, of escaping the encounter with the devil. So the knight turns his back on the devil and he ignores him. So thus there's a possibility of not succumbing to the devil of temptation. So, but my last video was very long, with 1.5 hours or even more, and so I don't want to go into that much detail today. So I will limit myself here to a small suggestion or for further study of the significance of Albrecht Dürer for Thomas Mann's work. Because, as I mentioned, there are 3 engravings by Albrecht Dürer who are regarded his master engravings, and they were produced within a short period of time, all between 1513 and 1514, and they are often considered and interpreted together. So there's the engraving Melancholia, number 1. There's this engraving, Night, Death, and the Devil. And the third one, the engraving Saint Jerome, which looks like this. And it shows Saint Jerome in his study with many objects that also are allusions to learnedness, to studying the sciences. So there's a vast amount of literature on the interpretation of these 3 engravings. And one interpretation is that they represent 3 different ways of life. Number 1 is sinking into melancholy. Number 2 is the active life, in which one, like a knight, fights for the good, for the Christian values. And the third one, the intellectual life of study and contemplation, like St. Jerome, studying the world in order to fully understand the world. So, and I think you can find references to all 3 engravings in the novel, and you can also interpret it in such a way that Hans' behavior reflects or imitates each of the 3 attitudes towards life. In turn, in the first part of the novel, it's more like the indecisive, idle, melancholy type. Then in the previous session about his research, so it's more the contemplative, studious life, like St. Jerome, where Hans studied a lot, wanted to understand the world and all its miracles and enigmas. And then in this section, in which Hans touchingly cares for the ones who are doomed to death. So it's the attitude of the knight fighting for the good and doing the good work of faith in Christianity and good work of charity. Okay, but for today, I will have to limit myself to just these hints. And if you're more interested, you can do your own research. I think you will find abundant material about the interpretation of these engravings and how they might be linked to the novel or also to other novels written by Thomas Mann. So now let's move on to the fourth point, the symbolism of numbers, or in a nutshell, in an equation, 7 plus 3 equals 10. We've often talked about the special significance of the number 7 in this novel. And in the previous section, research, then something changed. The number 3 emerged as another number with a symbolic significance. And the number 3 also plays a major role in this Dance of Death section. It's always used to express something in a particularly comprehensive way. I'll just give you a few, so that if Thomas Mann wants to express something in a comprehensive way, it's always using 3 modes to describe the same thing, or describing 3 different aspects of the same thing. Just a few examples, just picked from the first 2 pages of this section. Christmas consists of 3 days, which in turn each consists of morning, noon, and evening. The ladies, after Knut's arrival, they display a proneness to 3 types of behavior: laugh, to bicker, and to adorn their persons. And they boast of having met Knut in 3 different places: in the garden, in the forest, or in the English Quarter. And Knut's friend, when they were walking, they were singing, roving, and staff brandishing youths. And Hans Castorp has 3 different feelings when he thinks of his fellow Hamburgers, Hamburg citizens. It's shyness, it's feeling uncomfortable, it's fear. Christmas Eve was approaching, it was just around the corner, and it had become the present. So always this 3 elements who are listed. So now we have 2 important symbolic numbers. We have the 7 and we have 3. And I don't think it's a coincidence that now in this chapter also the number of doomed and dying people talked about in this chapter are exactly 10. So the sum of 7 and 3. It's the gentleman rider, and looking back, Fritz Reuter. It's Laila Gerngross, it's Fritz Rotbein, and the overfilled Frau Zimmermann. And we've also learned that these 5 they actually die in the weeks of winter. And then there's another set of 5 people who are introduced as being doomed to die, but of whom we don't know exactly when or if they die. It's Lauro, it's Teddy, it's Mr. Ferge, it's Mrs. von Mallinckrodt, and it's Karin Karstedt. And I don't want to harp on endlessly about the symbolic meaning of the numbers here, because I think there's also a danger of over-interpreting things and seeing patterns where there aren't any, and seeing number references everywhere. Maybe sometimes one tends to see numbers where they are just coincidental. So it happened to me when I was looking at the engravings, and I noticed, the year that is given in here, 1513. If you sum up all the different numbers, 1513, then again it's 10. But of course, you have to be a bit careful here. Maybe it's just an incident that's just coincidental. But I do believe that it is basically right to keep your eyes open as to whether and how Thomas Mann uses such number symbolism in this novel. And I think he is doing this also with a slight tongue-in-cheek approach, as a little game he's playing with the reader. So we shouldn't take all this deadly serious. But now I would like to move on to the 5th and final point for today. as I mentioned earlier, in a way, this is a mixed bag. It's a series of smaller observations or motifs that I find interesting, but I don't want to go into them at length. On the one hand, we see that a couple of topics from previous chapters are taken up again here, or now they are more illustrated with examples. For example, in the chapter Research, it was emphasized that procreation is the fusion of opposites, and that the tension and tragedy of human existence arises from this fusion of opposites. But at that time, in the early 1920s, people knew a little bit about hereditary rules and Mendel's laws, but it was not known exactly what role heredity plays, for example, in relation to character traits or to illnesses. But nevertheless, these theoretical considerations are from the research section are now illustrated very nicely in this chapter by the example of Laila Gerngross. The difference between the parents is described in a very striking way. On the one hand, there's this robust, retired major, the father of Laila, and then the tender, weak mother. So the discrepancy between their two personalities and their physicality is described in detail. And as is the mother's despair when she suspects that Laila might have inherited her susceptibility to tuberculosis from her. So that's another sort of tragic situation, not the classical tragical consolation like it's in the antique drama or tragedy where one can be blamelessly guilty, but here's a situation of someone who is feeling guilty even though she is objectively blameless without any guilt. Okay, then another one is a little observation about botany. And on the elements. Earth and water, or earth and moisture, are two important elements here that play a role in all the floral gifts for the dying. On the one hand, the smell of earth and water, or smell of earth and humidity, moisture, it is repeatedly described as the dominant smell in the flower shop where Hans and Joachim buy the flowers they use as a present. Or later, when Hans remembers Laila Gerngross, he mostly remembers the smell of the earth and the moisture of her hands. So air, earth, and water are very important elements here. I'll come to that later, what this might mean. And now I come to botany. The first flower that Hans and Joachim buy as a gift for this first dying woman or girl, for Laila, this is a hydrangea. So, and the botanical name of this flower, hydrangea, it also contains the Greek word for water. So there is this connection to water and earth is very. This symbolism is emphasized very strongly here in all the talk about the flowers, and there's always this talk about the smell of earth and water, these elements. I think this may be a reference to the ancient theory of temperaments, where all what one at that time considered the four elements: earth, wind, fire, and earth, water, fire, and air. Hope I got that right. Air, water, fire, earth. And these were considered the four main elements of earth, and there also to each of the element a specific character was linked. And so, according to this theory, the elements earth and water, they stand for the melancholic and the phlegmatic, and for autumn and winter. And I think all this makes sense. So we are at the end of autumn, the beginning of winter, and I think that Hans has indeed shown characteristics of both of those temperaments so far. this tendency, melancholy and phlegmatic, this tendency to drift lazily or to sink into melancholy daydreams. And in view of the proximity of death, this melancholy, earthy mood keeps spreading throughout this chapter, and it reaches its climax when Hans and Joachim take a walk to the cemetery together with the terminally ill Karen until they stand in front of a free place, so an empty grave. So they are already looking, and I think that at that moment it becomes so clear to all of them that they are looking at the future resting place of Karen, where she will soon lie in the ground, in the soil, in the earth. Okay, that's it. The very a sad part of the story. Maybe a little fun fact about Karen and the episode of Karen to cheer things a little bit up. There's also a visit to the movie theater described, and there's also a brief description of the film's adventurous plot. And connoisseurs of film history have been able to identify the movie described here. It is the German silent film Sumurun by Ernst Lubitsch. It was released in cinemas in 1920. And we know that Thomas Mann actually went to the movies to watch this film in 1920, in the period when he was writing The Magic Mountain. So he used this impression from his visit to the cinema in this novel when he give a short description of the plot of the film that Hans and Joachim and Karen watched here. But by describing this movie, however, he also built a small anachronism into the novel, because at the time of the novel's plot, it was early. It was in the time of the novel's plot is in 1908. So at this time, films of this length and with such a complex plot didn't even exist. So at that time, in 1908, Hans Castorp would not have been able to watch such a movie in Davos. And 12 years later, the technology had advanced massively, and so it's clearly a 1920s film that is described here. If you're interested in the film Sumurun, it's now freely available on the internet, for example, also on YouTube, because it's now in the public domain. One last point is a small observation that I came across thanks to a suggestion from a German subscriber, Gabi, who regularly comments on the Magic Mountain videos. She drew my attention to the song line, Leise, leise, fromme Weise. I don't remember how it is translated into English, or whether it is translated. This is a song line which Mrs. Stör incorrectly attributes to Tannhäuser, but actually this is an aria from the German opera written by Karl Maria von Weber, the opera Der Freischütz. And I had an interesting exchange with Gabi in which we pondered together why Thomas Mann might be quoting an aria from the Freischütz here. And we came across an exciting parallel that also shows how carefully Thomas Mann selected even such seemingly insignificant quotations, which he simply puts into the mouth of a minor character. If you abstract the plot of the opera a little, there are striking parallels to the Magic Mountain novel. At this point in the novel, we are heading towards a climax in the relationship between Hans and Claudia Chauchat, a love affair that is as yet unfulfilled. And also the opera Freischütz is about a love affair that is still in limbo. So there's a certain Max who wants to marry Agathe, but first, before being allowed to marry her, he would have to fire a successful test shot at a shooting competition. But unfortunately, Max is only an average marksman. So just as Hans Castorp is only average in many respects, and Max, in order to secure his success, nevertheless, he makes a kind of a pact with the devil to get special bullets that always hit their mark. And in a way, also Hans enters into a pact with a diabolical figure. After all, he has agreed to make Settembrini his mentor, and Settembrini has been characterized several times as a diabolical figure. He has been even directly been referred to by the name Satan or Sataness. And yeah, in the opera Der Freischütz, there is a happy ending. Everything is resolved in the end, and Max can marry his Agathe. Let's see whether Hans' love for Clavidia will soon take such a positive turn. We will find out in the next section, Walpurgis-Night, and there will be a video about the section in about a week's time. But until then, I hope you enjoy your reading, and in the meantime, of course, I look forward to your comments, questions, or additions, which I always appreciate very much. And so I hope to see you next time. Until then, take care, bye bye, and ciao.